So our center is housed within the Pacific Inclusive Education and Resources Center, or PEER for short. PEER is managed by faculty and staff at the Center on Disabilities Studies located on the University of Hawaii at Manoa campus. The overarching goal of our center is to nurture untapped talents through inclusive practices. To reach this goal, we host monthly speaker series as well as an in-person symposium that focuses on building awareness on neurodiversity and twice exceptionality. Our speakers series and symposiums are made possible through funding from the U.S. Department of Education Jacob K. Javits Gifted and Talented Education Program grant. Each month of our speaker series will focus on a different topic and perspectives from well-known speakers in the areas of inclusion, neurodiversity, and education. And I'm happy to introduce today's speaker, Emily Kir.cher-Morris. She is a licensed professional counselor, author, and podcast host with a passion for neurodiversity. Inspired by her own neurodivergent journey, she has authored several books related to supporting neurodivergent people and hosts the Neurodiversity Podcast. Emily provides professional development worldwide, with many of her resources available on the Neurodiversity University online platform. Based in St. Louis, Missouri, she specializes in mental health support for neurodivergent individuals and their families. In her presentation today, entitled Nobody's Perfect, Emily will provide specific strategies to use in the classroom or counseling setting to work both individually and in groups with students to overcome perfectionism. So now, without further ado, please welcome Emily.
Thank you so much. I'm super happy to be here and chatting with you. I'll give you a little bit of background just about my experiences that kind of brought me to this work as we get into this. I actually started my career in education. I was a classroom teacher, and then I taught in the gifted ed classroom. I got a master's in gifted education, and I taught both at the elementary and the middle school levels, in a variety of different types of gifted ed programs, including I taught for a little bit in a program for exceptionally gifted students. But what I really loved about that work always was the social and emotional side of things. So I ended up going back and getting a second master's in counseling. I worked for a while as a school counselor, and then I bridged into my practice, my clinical practice. And so now that's where I work primarily. I see my clients and do mental health counseling for neurodivergent people, and a lot of gifted and twice exceptional people. It's always interesting. Like when I entered my practice, I really thought that my specialization was going to be just with gifted individuals. And I realized that first of all, I don't know. It's a skewed sample for sure, but also there are not a lot of just gifted. There's a lot of twice exceptionality out there, and especially the people who are seeking out support, right? They're often twice exceptional because they often have this discrepancy between their ability and what else is going on with them. I've specialized in twice exceptionality. My first book that I wrote for educators, Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners, was published a few years ago. I've got a couple of parenting books out there. And my newest book that's going to be out in January is Neurodiversity Affirming Schools, Transforming Practices So All Students Feel Accepted and Supported. And this is really a book that's looking at the systemic changes we need to make in our schools to support all of our neurodivergent students, whether they're gifted, twice exceptional, or have any other type of neurotype that needs some different types of supports, because our schools just really aren't cut out for the kids who are the outliers in a wide range. So I'm super excited about that. As it was mentioned, I'm the host of the Neurodiversity Podcast, and I always mention to people, even if you're not a podcast listener, it's a great free resource to share with parents, with people, because I know so many parents, it's like, they don't have time to sit down and read a whole book, but they can listen to a 30-minute podcast, maybe at 1.5 times speed even, and get through it. So, but don't tell my husband I said that. He does all the production on the podcast. He'd be very upset if I told people to listen to it at 1.5 times speed. He gets mad at me. Anyway, that's how I listen to podcasts though, so it's okay. I give permission. Anyway. So I'm also the parent of three kids. They are 16, 14, and 9, and they are all twice exceptional. And so, it's kind of my whole life with all of this. And so I love this presentation. I love talking about perfectionism. I love challenging the beliefs that people have about perfectionism and what we think we know about perfectionism, and having people even have the opportunity to reflect on their own experiences and their own perfectionism. But we'll start off by talking a little bit about some of the theory, some of the why, some of like what is this really, and then the second half of the presentation really will be focused on some very specific practical strategies that you can implement with your students, with your own children, with whomever it is that you're supporting. So I want to start off just by giving a definition of perfectionism, and I feel like this is a good one. This is from the book Letting Go of Perfect by Jill Adelson and Hope Wilson. And the 2021 version is the revised version, it's the second edition, which is great. I like how they updated it. But their definition that they use for perfectionism is setting unreasonably high expectations for oneself, including an intolerance of mistakes. And so the key word in this definition that we really want to focus on is unreasonably. Because when we think about our very bright kids, it's hard to know what is unreasonable when they have all of this potential. It really is difficult to get a feel for what that cutoff is. And so, a few things that we know about perfectionism. First of all, perfectionism is not exclusive to gifted individuals. We see it across the board, all various levels of intelligence. However, what we do know is that giftedness is domain specific, meaning that usually it's in an area where somebody has a particular strength that they exhibit that perfectionism. So a very talented athlete might be a perfectionist when it comes to the drills that they do for whatever sport they play, or a very talented artist who's who has high ability or strength in that domain of art is going to show those perfectionistic tendencies most likely in that particular area. So we talk about perfectionism in schools a lot about gifted kids because that is the domain, that is their strength. They often have academic strengths. And so they get frustrated because they know that they can do well from a very young age. They learn quickly, they learn easily. They don't always have a lot of opportunity to struggle, which is part of the reason why gifted identification and programs and supports are so important. But it's hard because they learn really quickly. And so they go through it really fast and they just expect to do well. So we want to make sure that we're helping kids recognize what are those unreasonably high expectations. So what we're going to do next is we're going to do a little self-survey to look at the three different types of perfectionism. So I'm going to ask you to do some reflection for yourself. And so what I would suggest is grab a pencil and a piece of paper if you have one. If you want to open your notes app on your phone, there are basically 3 sets of 5 questions each that you're going to rate yourself on. If you want to test your working memory and just try to keep tabs in your head, you can do that too. There's no, whatever works for you. But we're going to go through these 3 different types of perfectionism and see specifically kind of where that falls and how how this might manifest in some of our students. Okay, so everyone ready? All right, here we go. So here's our first question. So rate yourself on this. When I am working on something, I cannot relax until it is perfect. So it's on a scale of 1 through 5, 1 if that is very much not like you, a 5 if it is very much like you. So when I'm working on something, I can't relax until it is perfect. Okay, let's look at our next one. I must always work to my full potential. Give yourself a 1 if that's not like you, or a 5 if that is very much like you. I must always work to my full potential. All right, the third one in this set. I seldom feel the need to be perfect. This is reverse scored, just to mess with you a little bit. So this one, if you agree with this statement, that it is not like you, you're giving if you disagree with this statement, I can't even say it correctly. If you disagree with this statement and it's not like you give yourself a 5. And if it is very much like you, give yourself a 1. It's confusing when I get a little backwards with it every single time. Those reverse scored items. Okay, the next one says, it makes me uneasy to see an error in my work. So a 1 if that is not like you, a 5 if that is very much like you. So it makes me uneasy to see an error in my work. And then the last one for this set, this is also reverse scored. So a 5 if it's not like you, a 1 if it is. I do not have to be the best at whatever I'm doing. I do not have to be the best at whatever I'm doing. So a 5 if that's not like you, a 1 if that is very much like you. So go ahead and tabulate that, add those up. So your score is going to fall somewhere between a range of 5 through 25. This is based on a questionnaire, the multidimensional perfectionism something. If you Google it, it'll come up. I don't have it listed right here with me. But this is not norm referenced. Okay. So there's no perfect score here. You're not going to get a perfect score. But what we know is like, basically, if you scored like a 15 or higher, you're probably more like this type of perfectionist. If you scored like 14 or lower, this is a little bit less like you. So it's not like there's a cutoff score or anything specifically, but you can just kind of recognize those patterns. So this specifically describes self-oriented perfectionism. Self-oriented perfectionism. So self-oriented perfectionism talks about high expectations for oneself, where you really want, that 100%, you wanted to be the best, you really have to always exceed expectations. It's also associated with a striving for excellence, but also with a lot of self-criticism. So when I'm working with clients, I will often find that this type of perfectionism, I find is probably the easiest to try to reframe. Not that it's easy, but it is the easiest of the three because we can shift it. It's good to have a striving for excellence. We want to try to be good and learn and perform well. And so it's moving away from that unreasonable piece. It's moving away from the intolerance of mistakes that we can then get to that place where it's like, I'm trying really hard. I'm doing the best that I can. And it's okay if I make mistakes. Okay. So that's self-oriented perfectionism. So let's go on to this next one. So here's your next set of 5. So your next question here. So on a scale of 1 through 5, I find it difficult to meet others' expectations of me. I find it difficult to meet others' expectations of me. So a 5 if that's very much like you, a 1 if that is not like you at all. Our next one here is, I feel that people are too demanding of me. So 5 if that's very much like you, a 1 if that is not like you. I feel like people are too demanding of me. Our next question on this section, my family expects me to be perfect. My family expects me to be perfect. So 5 is very much like me, a 1 is not like me. This one is reverse scored, so 5 if it's not like you, 1 if it is. So others will accept me even if I don't excel at everything. Others will accept me even if I don't excel at everything. And then the last one for this set, I'm afraid I will let down the people I respect if I'm not perfect. I'm afraid I will let down the people I respect if I'm not perfect. So again, go ahead and total those up. It's going to range from a score of 5 through 25. So if you're over 15, you're kind of more like this. Under 14 or under, not so much. And so this is specifically about what we call socially prescribed perfectionism. So socially prescribed perfectionism talks about the perception of pressure from parents, teachers, friends, society. It is often associated with feelings of helplessness. I don't have any control over this. This is just what I have to do. This is what people expect of me. And it's so interesting. I've been listening. As many of you have probably heard of this book called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. I've been listening to the audiobook recently, and one of the things they're talking about, this whole book is very much about like social media use with adolescents and teens, and the negative effects of it, and the scores of studies that we have that just really show how impactful it is. But one of the biggest impacts, especially on teen girls, is that they are experiencing much higher rates of socially prescribed perfectionism because of the use of social media. They feel like society expects certain things from them. They have to look a certain way, they have to behave a certain way. And so this really has been increasing that anxiety for them. What I sometimes notice is that there are times when I'm working with kids and they might think that they're experiencing socially prescribed perfectionism. They might assign their perfectionism to the pressures from outside, but it really is more of a social, they're a self-oriented, but it's about that perception of pressure. We also, though, have to be careful, like especially as parents or educators. Like on the one hand, I talk to parents all the time who say things like, "Well, I don't really care about their grades. I just want them to do well. I want them to try hard." And then at the same time, the grades come home and they're like, "Well, what is this C about? What happened with this B here?" And so they get mixed messages there. So we have to be really careful about how we're communicating what our expectations are, and really helping kids learn to set their own parameters for what success means, and what is meaningful to them. So let's go on to our third type of perfectionism here. So again, you can score yourself. So the first one says, I have high expectations for the people who are important to me. I have high expectations for the people who are important to me. The next question here says, I respect people who are average at their jobs. This one is reverse scored. So if that's very much like you, if you respect people who are average at their jobs, give yourself a 1. If that's very much not like you, then you give yourself a 5 or somewhere in between. Our next one says, it is important that the people I am close to, my children, my partner, are successful. So 5 if that's very much like you, a 1 if that is not like you. The fourth one here, I'm easily frustrated when people working with me have poor work quality. A 5 if that's very much like you, a 1 if that's not like you. These are the kids or adults who are like, group project, it's okay, I'll do it. I'll just take it on and do it myself. And then our last one here, I seldom expect others to excel at whatever they're doing. So again, this is reverse scored. 5 if it's not like you, 1 if it is. So I seldom expect others to excel at whatever they're doing. So again, you can see how this might also be domain specific. Like I might have different feelings about the people I work with in one setting versus people in my personal life. So there's some variation there. But this specifically is what we call others-oriented perfectionism. Others-oriented perfectionism, when we hold others to unrealistically high standards. We really expect them to do everything as we would do it. I find that these are often kids who, like, when they're in the school setting, they come across as the know-it-all. These are the students who in the class, they would raise their hands. Oh, Mrs. Kir.cher-Morris, you forgot the comma in that sentence. You're welcome, right? Like and it's not, many times they're not trying to be, abrasive. A lot of times it's actually, they have such high standards for themselves and they would not want to be embarrassed by making that mistake. And so they're attempting to offer some assistance. But other times it's just, they just don't really always understand how it comes across. And so they often think that they're helping. I had a client, I was doing a small group with some social navigation strategies these were gifted kids. This was during the time of COVID. We were doing these groups virtually and we were talking about perfectionism. And there was this one kiddo who clearly showed a lot of these traits. And basically I have a child version of this that I've created, which by the way, I will share it along with the handouts. If you can share that out to everybody who's registered and you can use it, you can just use it however you'd like. It's not, it's a free resource. And so, but basically we did this child version and he said to me afterwards, he goes, Miss Emily, He goes, I think this others-oriented perfectionism might be my entire personality. And my heart kind of broke for him a little bit. I mean, it was good for him to kind of have that self-reflection because he never really understood why he was getting so much negative feedback from his peers. But it was because he had so many rules. He was so rigid about things. He really had a hard time when other people would make mistakes. And again, part of that was about how he would have handled those situations. But we know that these are kids who sometimes struggle, whether it's in group work or just in just regular social situations. And so we can see all of these different types of perfectionism. There are other times when perfectionism looks like something else. So this is a list of the 5 different types of perfectionists that Jill Adelson and Hope Wilson talk about in their book, Letting Go of Perfect. And so I really like these. So basically, they talk about the fact that it doesn't always look just like academic achievement, although that is one type of persona that we might see. So the academic achiever is the student who has to get 100% every single time. It has to be 100%. If it's a 94%, it's not good enough. I should have studied more. I should have really, done better. And so that is one type of perfectionism. You also have the kids who are the risk evaders. So these are the kids who are going to do it all or nothing. They're either going to do it perfectly, or they're just not going to do it at all, because it's easier to go into something confident that you can do it really well than to try something and feel uncertain about it and do poorly. So they just don't feel comfortable with that level of vulnerability. They don't feel comfortable with the fact that they might make a mistake there. So they just don't, they avoid that risk. They evade that risk. The aggravated accuracy assessor is the student who is hyper focused on exactness and redos. So they get fixated on it. And so can think of a client who I had who would spend hours on her math homework, and she was an excellent math student, but she would just go over it and over it and over it. Or another student who I had who was a younger student, she was in high school at the time that she was doing this. This was actually a student I had when I was teaching. He would sit there with a piece of paper, and for anything that we were writing, he would write a phrase and he would erase it, and he would write a phrase and he would erase it, and he would write a phrase and he would erase it, because it just wasn't just right. And so it was very difficult for him to produce any work because he would get so caught up in all of this. Actually, one thing I ended up doing with him was taking away his erasers, because I just wanted him to show that he would, I just need to know your thought process. I can't help you if I don't see what your thought process is here. So let's just write it out. And as you write it out, it's okay if you cross it out, but just line it out, but then keep going. So then I can kind of see where your brain has been as you're doing this. But he would get focused on that as well. The controlling image manager is the one who makes the excuse like, well, I could have done it if I wanted to. I could have won that game. I could have gotten an A. I could have done it but not wanting to try too hard, because if you try really hard and you don't do as well, then that means you're imperfect. And so it's kind of this balancing where they're holding back almost a little bit, because it's easier to feel like you have control over that than to try and not be successful. And then the last one is the procrastinating perfectionist, those kids who they get so wrapped up, and if it stays in my mind, I can't fail. I'm going to think about it. I'm going to work on the details. And then eventually, by the time they do have to produce something, they have so little time that it can't be perfect. And then it kind of gets into some of that controlling image piece where it's like, oh, well, if I had had more time, I could have done this. It could have been perfect. But sometimes that's overwhelming, because especially for our very bright kids, they often have really amazing ideas about what they can do and how something could look, especially when it's a project. They get these big picture ideas, but the reality of implementing them is not possible. And so then they get really frustrated with themselves when it doesn't turn out the way that they want it to. And so that can become a barrier for them. There's another term. This is a term that was coined by Jim Webb, who was the main author of the book A Parent's Guide to Gifted Children, the original version. He has passed away now. And actually, I was the co-author on the revision that just came out, I guess last year, the second edition of this. But he talks about goal vaulting. And goal vaulting is something that we see very often in gifted kids, where basically they have a goal, they have a benchmark, and as they get close to it, they raise the bar. And so what happens is they feel like they're never actually accomplishing anything. They get this idea that like because something is just out of reach, they haven't learned anything. They haven't made any progress. So I had a client one time who was a gymnast actually, and we would work through this quite a bit. And every time, I don't know if any of you, have kids or did gymnastics yourself, but basically it's like you have all these levels when you're at the competitive gymnastics level, and you have to, once you master certain skills, you get to go on to the next level. Well, anytime she had a new skill and it was taking her a while to get it, she got so down on herself, so stressed out, so anxious, lots of negative self-talk, lots of self-criticism. And so on multiple occasions, we would get out the dry erase board and we would draw these little stair steps. And we would talk about, okay, you're working on this skill right now. Let's talk about every single thing that you had to master to even get to this point to be able to do this, to really make it very concrete and tangible for her to realize, like, yes, I am making progress. I am going further with this. But we want to be aware of this because, again, because gifted kids make progress so quickly, because they can master those things, we have to make sure that they really are recognizing when they reach those benchmarks and having some of that, that pride and a feeling of self-efficacy that they're able to do those things. We often associate perfectionism with a fear of failure. So what if I look dumb, or other people do this better than me, or I haven't been taught how to do this before, so I better not risk messing it up. And so that's one side of things, but there's also this perfectionism side of things that is a fear of success. So like I have this perfectionism, I know I can do well. I love med school, but what if I hate being a doctor? I'm afraid that I'm going to do well, but then it's not going to work out for me. Or people will like me more if I'm not the best. So having this drive to want to do really well, but then having this fear of success that then prevents us from reaching that level. Or as I get better at playing piano, people are going to keep expecting more of me. And so I just don't even want to start it because I know that I'm going to have to keep doing it. And so, there's all of these different sides of perfectionism that we might see with our kids. So sometimes we'll talk about, we talked about procrastination just a little bit, but there are some other things that might impact this when we see procrastination and what else might be impacting it. So first of all, processing speed differences are huge for a lot of our gifted kids, especially for our twice exceptional gifted autistic kids. So there's research out of the University of Iowa with Megan Foley-Nickpun. She did a lot of research about this. And one of the most common profiles that we see in gifted autistic kids is that they often have a very high verbal composite score on their cognitive profile, coupled with a very low, below average processing speed score. It takes them longer. They think more deeply. They really have to reflect on things and put things in order. It kind of has to do with some executive functioning. And so that can look like perfectionism. It can look like procrastination, but it might just be a processing speed delay where kids need more time to really think about how they're responding or think about what they're doing or think about how they're going to get started. It can also be combined with perfectionism and procrastination too. Processing speed differences aren't mutually exclusive from those. Executive functioning difficulties, obviously, just having trouble with that task initiation. And so when you layer that with some perfectionism, where I have this big idea, but then also I'm afraid of it not coming to fruition, having those that trouble with task initiation as an executive functioning difficulty can be a barrier as well. Sometimes we see kids who are just overcommitted. So it's really interesting. Perfectionists tend to be people who, well, not all perfectionists, but a lot of perfectionists tend to be people pleasers because that's its own form of perfectionism, like not wanting people to think poorly of me. But additionally, people will ask for us to do things, ask for help. And the perfectionist will sit there and go, well, I can do that. I can do it well. I might be able to do it better than other people. And so it makes it harder to say no, but then they become overcommitted. Another piece of this is the perfectionist who's just a really high achiever in all these different areas. It kind of is connected with some multi-potentiality where you have all of these things going on and you feel like you have to be perfect at all of them. And it really stretches our kids thin. We see this quite a bit in some of those kids. And so how do you prioritize? How do you figure out what are you going to take off of your plate? because that is just a recipe for burnout when you have all of those things and you're trying to be perfect in all of these different areas. So we want to help kids focus on progress, not perfection, and recognize that the process is so much more important than the product. So I have a client who I'm working with. He is currently a college student. He's at the community college. He is gifted and autistic. And I've been working with him since he was in second grade. We have been talking about this since second grade, about it's about the process, it's about what you're learning. It's not about the grade. And this is the tricky part about it. We will sit there and tell kids, we will want them to be motivated. We will tell them it's all about, what you learn and wanting to, broaden your, experiences and all these things. And then they're in school and then we slap a grade on everything they're doing. And so it's like, it's kind of this, we're contradicting ourselves because we say the process is more important than the product, but then we get very hyper-focused on grades, which is just the product. But I will tell you, so the student is currently taking some computer programming classes, and they're hard. And he got a C this semester in one of his classes, but he has finally gotten to the point where he is appreciating the process and recognizing that even though I got a C, I'm still learning. And he used to have these meltdowns about things that he couldn't get, that he was just such a perfectionist. Again, a lot of black and white thinking there. And so I do love a little bit that feeling as a clinician to I would never say it in a session, like I told you so, but also just like going, remember all the times we've had this conversation and now you're he goes, I know, you're right. Because you always are. And we have a very great rapport, obviously. And so it's just funny, but it's important for kids to realize this, that it is about the process. Just from my own experience, I really, especially when I was young, did not like any sort of that feeling of vulnerability. I was a swimmer. I was a decent swimmer. I ran cross country my first 2 years of high school. I hated it. I was bad at it. I was at the back of the pack. My dad wanted me to run cross country, so I ran cross country, and it was the worst. And because I could not get past this idea that the process was more important than the product, and that I could still make progress even if I wasn't winning. And so it wasn't until I was like in my actually close to 30s, my early 30s, I started running again. I've done some triathlons, but just that maturity and being able to look at it and go, it's like, I know I'm not going to win any of this. I'm just doing it to challenge myself, to see if I can, to make that progress, to see that growth. But we want kids to have that opportunity. So where do they have that opportunity in their day-to-day lives to see that growth? And this is kind of where I get back to that piece about for gifted education programs being so important, because you can't see that growth if you're not struggling. And so we need kids to have and experience that productive struggle to know what that feels like and feel that sense of pride when they are making that progress. So I have some little cartoons here of Calvin and Hobbes, who I think Calvin is probably twice exceptional. Lots of asynchrony there with him. But anyway, so Hobbes is sitting there talking to him. You're going to juggle eggs. It's a metaphor for life, Hobbes. Each egg represents one of life's concerns, and the goal is to give each the appropriate amount of individual attention while simultaneously watching and guiding all the others. Life is about balance and staying quick and alert as everything threatens to spin out of control. And sometimes we make a big mess out of things, but the important thing is persistence. We need kids to fail. We need them to try all these things, to have these ideas, to have these goals, and to give it a shot. But recognize even when they fail, it's about the process. The important thing is the persistence there. So one strategy that I really love when I am working with perfectionists is this idea of testing perfectionistic hypotheses. So I actually use this with a lot of different areas when I have kids who have a lot of anxiety, where we just view whatever it is as a problem. We say, what would happen if? So kids learn about the scientific method from the time they are very young. They're in kindergarten and they're learning about the scientific method. And so kids know how to create a hypothesis, how to create a method to test that hypothesis and collect that data. And so one of the things that happens is when you're feeling that stress, when you're feeling that anxiety about that failure, whatever it might be that's on the horizon, the best way to get through it is to experience it and realize like, oh, the world didn't end. So I will sometimes have kids and I'll say, what would happen if you were to intentionally get an item wrong on an assignment? What would happen if you intentionally skipped a problem on your test? What would happen if you turned in that assignment late? And what we end up doing is by doing this in a controlled environment, by doing it in a situation where it's a low stakes environment, they can actually practice this. Sometimes it's hard to get them on board. Sometimes it's hard to get their parents and teachers on board, but it really is the net benefit of this and experiencing it when it's a low stakes situation, like that's really powerful. And to realize like, yeah, you know what, I didn't turn in that assignment and I still got an A on my report card at the end of the quarter or whatever it is. My teacher didn't hate me, trying to just experience that and push back a little bit on some of those faulty beliefs that a lot of our perfectionistic kids have. Another piece of it is like just asking for help. Sometimes kids have a really hard time asking for help. They feel like they should be able to do things. Or another piece of it is sometimes when you have twice exceptional kids, if they have accommodations specifically, but they have that perfectionistic streak, they don't want to use the accommodations. They feel like they shouldn't need them or shouldn't have them or it's not fair. And so, we can just test it out. Let's just test it. Let's just see what happens. Let's see how it goes. And trying to make it very non-judgmental, very approachable, so it doesn't feel like it's pass fail. And so, I think that that's a way to get a little bit of buy-in with kids and help them work through some of those things. So here's Calvin again. The teacher reminded us that we only have a week left to finish our leaf collection, so we ought to be half done by now. You haven't even started. Yeah, but I work better under pressure. Actually, you work only under pressure. That way, the work is more miserable, but there's less of it. I can relate to that. And I think a lot of our kids can too, where we want them to, again, we want them to experience some of that struggle and realize, the pressure is okay, but you don't have to have such high pressure all of the time on everything you're doing. One question that I often get with all of this is a lot of perfectionists can actually end up developing learned helplessness. So first of all, learned helplessness, just to kind of give a good example, I found this little video. It's so cute. I'm going to play it for you. It's this little bird who has never struggled and has never had to feed himself. So he is chasing this little worm and he is telling the worm to get in the place where the food goes. And he's always had his mama bird feed him throughout all of his life. And so he doesn't know how to successfully do this. And this is something that we have to be careful of when we are working with these kids who have these really high standards, because what happens sometimes is that they become I don't know, the word is not coming to me. Like they want to check. They want to come up and say, is this right? Can you look at my work? Can you do this? Am I on the right track? They have to, the more we give them that, the more we go, yep, you're on, it's okay to give some of that praise. It's okay to give some of that encouragement and that feedback, but we really need them to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because that's where you start to take the risks. That's where you start to learn how to do things more independently. And so we want to be kind of cautious about that and really try to push them to have more of that independence, to take those risks, to experience those failures. Because if everything always is a success, that just builds that perfectionism and again that learned helplessness where they just won't try anything because they feel like if they can't do it perfectly, it's not worth doing. So one of the things I like to really use with this is dialectics. So this comes from dialectical behavior therapy, but it's great in a lot of different situations. And it really recognizes that there is more than one way to see a problem or to solve, to see a situation or to solve a problem. So two things that seem like or are even opposites can both be true at the same time. So it moves us from an either or a black and white perspective to a both and. So recognizing that both of these things can coexist. So for example, I'm doing the best I can and I need to find some ways to try to do better, right? Or I can do this and it's going to be really hard. Like just because something's going to be really hard doesn't mean that you can't do it. And so, I find that quite often when kids are feeling dysregulated, when they are feeling stressed out, they go to these very, you know, direct black and white statements, this is too hard. I can't do it. It's like, no, this is hard. It is hard. We can validate that. And you can do it. And you can get through and make some attempts with it. And so the more we use this, the more we focus on that flexibility and finding that way to look at things in different ways, the better they will be equipped to handle those situations. So here's Calvin again, talk about goal setting. Look, Calvin, you've got to relax a little. Your balance will be better if you're loose. I can't help it. Imminent death makes me tense. I admit it. You need to concentrate on your goal. My goal is to dismantle this bicycle and mail every piece to a different country so it can never be rebuilt. Okay, that's not a good goal. Well, I'm not changing it. Again, this is in both and. This is hard and you can do it. You can try it. Like this, we can lower the stakes. Like what is the worst thing that's going to happen? You're going to fall, you're going to scrape your knee, you're going to get a B on a test, you're going to, take a risk and maybe not make the varsity team, only make the JV team this year, whatever it might be. But that's all okay. And so you can still grow through that. So we've talked about a lot about vulnerability throughout this conversation, and we just really have to help normalize this for kids. Because so many bright kids do really well at things and things come very naturally to them, they don't often have this experience of that vulnerability, about asking for help, about being okay with not being the best. And so some of the things that we can do is we can have conversations and focus on shame versus guilt about mistakes. And so if any of you are familiar with Brené Brown, this is some of her stuff that she talks about a lot, but she really differentiates between the two feelings of shame and guilt. So guilt specifically is like, I did something wrong, I made a mistake, I did something bad, but there's an actionable piece to it. I can fix it, I can do something about it. Shame is the feeling like, oh, I made this mistake, which means I am a bad person. It's like an identity, it's a quality. And that is much harder to overcome. So this is why when we talk about accommodations or we talk about just our classroom structures and universal design, the more we can give opportunities for kids to fix their mistakes, to work on, to look at something and to give it a second try, it actually reduces that fear of it not being perfect the first time. And even if there's a little bit of that sense of guilt, like, oh, I didn't do as well or I didn't study as much as I should, if there's a process to improve it, that again brings the focus back on the growth, and it doesn't have to be that either or. We just want to really build self-advocacy skills. Again, a lot of kids, if things come naturally to them, they don't learn how to ask for help. And so we can offer structure for them. We can give them scripts. We can have them intentionally practice this, but we need our kids to be able to self-advocate. We really need them to be able to know when they need help and to know how to ask for help. And we can scaffold this for them. It doesn't always necessarily mean that they are asking for help verbally. It might mean that they're writing a note, putting on a dry erase board, using a signal of some kind, writing an email, but we want them to know that there are multiple pathways. The other thing I always mention too about self-advocacy is that we talk so much about self-advocacy with kids and like needing them to self-advocate, but what we need to also do as the adults is we need to make sure that we are opening the door for those students to self-advocate and giving them opportunities. If you think back to the last time you had to self-advocate for something, maybe you had to talk to a partner or a boss or a friend or who knows, whatever it might be, but you had to talk about something that was important to you and advocate for it, that's a really hard feeling. It does make us all feel really vulnerable when you're kind of opening yourself up to that. And so when I talk about opening the door for self-advocacy for kids, it's like here are the opportunities to tell me about what's going on, or how are you feeling about this. I have one, I did this training with a school district, and this one teacher talked about how she actually has in her classroom a desk that is designated for when kids need help, but she calls it the customer service desk, which I loved because it's like, yeah, this is my job. This is what I'm here for. I'm here to help you. But what a great way to normalize that asking for help. It's like, yeah, come on up to the customer service desk. I've got you. I thought that was such a great little spin on that to help normalize that for kids. And then just also finding those safe environments for risk taking. Where can we do this? And actually, again, this book is very top of mind because I'm almost done listening to it, The Anxious Generation. But he talks so much about how, because of the internet and the social media world that kids live in, they don't take a lot of risks. They don't go outside and fall and play games of football or whatever with the neighborhood kids, and somebody has to they fail with that, they lose, they have to navigate all of those situations because they spend so much time online as they get into adolescence. They don't take as many risks. They learn not to. And that actually kind of rewires their brain so they're constantly in defend mode. And if you're in defend mode, you're not going to take those risks. If you're a perfectionist, you're not going to try those things where you may fail. We need kids to be able to take risks, to fail, to have those experiences. So just noting, perfectionism is not necessarily a clinical concern in and of itself. It can definitely foster stress, it can foster anxiety, and that's what we need to be on the lookout for, is that it can tip over into some of these other areas. So, for example, one area that is associated with perfectionism is generalized anxiety. And so usually what something I always tell adults, they don't always realize this, is that when a child is experiencing anxiety, what we will usually notice on the outside is increased irritability. That's what it looks like. It looks like a change in their baseline where all of a sudden they're really cranky, they're really upset, they're just, harder to soothe, or to self-regulate, because kids aren't always great at verbalizing what they're really feeling inside. And so what we notice on the outside is that increased irritability. So be on the lookout for that. Perfectionism can also be tied with obsessive compulsive disorder, where it does become this obsession that it has to be perfect. And again, that's something that clinically we want to look at and get some support for. Depression, if you are a perfectionist and you feel like you just can't do it and nothing's ever going to work out the way you want, then that's definitely can lead to some depression. Eating disorders also is one of the few actual clinical diagnoses, again, that is positively correlated with perfectionism. A lot of kids who experience eating disorders also show maladaptive traits of perfectionism. So as we wrap up, before we get to, I've got one other thing actually here. I want one more slide after this. So here's Calvin again. I don't want to do my homework. I just want to have fun. Goes outside. Too much stress is unhealthy, I don't see why I had to come in. Kids are under so much stress these days. We really have to find ways for them to relax and be a kid. Because the next piece that comes from this is burnout. And so burnout specifically it's a psychological syndrome that really is emerging. It's not an official diagnosis, but it's caused by this prolonged exposure to chronic stress. And so it's characterized by overwhelming exhaustion, feelings of cynicism, and a sense of ineffectiveness or a lack of accomplishment. And so we really want to keep an eye on this and make sure that our kids aren't getting burnt out, because when you're burnt out, you just don't have anything left to give. And so it's really hard to recover from that. And perfectionists will push themselves to the point where they are just kind of like zombies going through the motions, even though they're totally in burnout. And we don't want our kids to have that happen. So hopefully we can look for these things and kind of recognize this. Here are two books. I didn't mention Lisa Van Gamert's book, Perfectionism, A Practical Guide to Managing Never Good Enough, but it's a great book. She was a guest on the podcast. We talked about it. And then Letting Go of Perfect is the one that I referenced a couple of times. So I would recommend both of those. And also The Anxious Generation, which I referred to, by Jonathan Haidt. So I'd love to see what questions anybody has, and I will stop the share. Like I said, I will share my handouts with you. And let's see. Okay, perfect. So yeah, any questions or thoughts, reflections? Is it not, it's still, oh, there it is. Okay, perfect.
Thank you so much, first of all, for the presentation. It was very insightful. It's a lot of little tidbits that I was like, oh, I can totally see that. Yeah. And the Calvin and Hobbes comics are
I
so,
love Calvin. I
yeah,
love
I remember growing up reading it, but now seeing some of the comic strips again, I was like, yeah, I didn't get this when I was a kid, but it makes sense. Yeah.
No, but it's so insightful in so many ways.
Yeah,
That
very.
and the Far Side. I always love the Far
Far
the
Side.
Far
Oh, I
Side.
haven't heard that one in a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great.
Looks like there's
Um,
a question in the chat. Can you suggest strategies to guide elementary school students in figuring out what is reasonable?
mm, I think, yeah, that's a really good question. Um, Part of what I think, this is kind of where I think it comes back on us as educators a little bit more, which is, again, providing appropriate challenge. If a child is in a setting that isn't challenging them, then it may not be unreasonable for them to learn to expect that they're always going to get 100% on everything, that everything's going to be really easy. And that's part of the problem. That's what feeds into the later problems. And so with elementary school kids, more than anything, I guess I'm thinking back to when I was teaching in the elementary school setting, and what I would really try was to encourage risk taking so that they would experience some of that failure. Like I think about one student who I had, who was doing some of that checking that I was mentioning, and she really struggled with any sort of writing assignment that was really ambiguous. If it didn't have a very clear right or wrong answer, she kind of got paralyzed and would get really stuck with it. And so we were doing this thing, and basically we were reading a novel. I don't even remember what it was. And all they had to do was pick a character that they recognized that they had some of the same character traits as that character did. Oh, she was in tears. She just was so overwhelmed by that idea. And it's like being encouraging, but also setting some boundaries as far as like, you can do this. I'm going to push you to try this, so that she can then overcome some of that and feel like, recognize that even though maybe it wasn't whatever in her mind was this idea of perfect, she was able to get something done and it was fine and it was good enough. For a long time, I kept my Facebook avatar or whatever, my profile picture was a coffee cup that said "World's Okayest Mom." And I think having those conversations with kids and recognizing like we all mess up, we all make mistakes, and it's about how do you treat yourself when you make those mistakes? How do you have that self-criticism? What is the self-talk that you're using there? Are you getting mad at yourself? Or are you going, oh, well, that didn't work out the way I wanted it to, and being more neutral about it. And so, finding those conversations and helping kids be more like, I don't know that you can find out the unreasonable part, but you could definitely find the part where it's about the intense self-criticism. And so that might be easier with some of those younger kids, if that helps.
Looks like we have another question in the chat. What are some strategies for a self-orientated perfectionist to overcome fear of success?
Yeah. This is one where it's just a lot of like self-reflection and realizing what's beneath that fear of attempting those things, because they might not even always be able to articulate it. And so when I go through that, it's almost one of those, like the fear of success, it's kind of tricky because it looks like perfectionism and it is perfectionism, and also, but it's often not, like they aren't aware always that that's what is happening with that, if that makes sense. And so when it's that fear of success, so really just helping them realize, what is that fear? Who are you afraid of letting down? Is it about yourself? Like, and walking through the kind of cause and effect, like, okay, so then what's going to happen? What will happen then? And what are your options? This is not exactly the same. This is just comes to mind, but this is a client who I have who I've been working with since she was in middle school. She's now an adult, and she has some OCD tendencies specifically about her health that are related to her health, and so it kind of manifests in some perfectionism where she gets really hyper focused on like it has to be just right, and so she gets worried. When she was little, she had asthma, she had an inhaler. And so she gets hyper focused on this and she gets really freaked out that she's going to be in a setting and she's going to have an asthma attack of some kind, which she hasn't had in years. And she's not going to have an inhaler with her. And so I was talking to her and I said, well, Sophie, she went, what would you do? if that happened? What would you do if you're on, and she said, well, I guess I would call 911. I'm like, okay. Like that's what I'm talking about with that. Like, what's the next logical thing? Like, you get caught up in this fear, in this very abstract, broad. It's like, well, what would you do? What would you do if that happened and you were successful? And then, like, if you're playing piano and you were worried about people continuing to expect more of you, what would you do? How would you handle it? Well, I would then, have, I guess I would talk to somebody and say, I don't want to play piano as much, right? Like it's just about following it through to its conclusion to find those logical strategies.
All right, and maybe one last question in the chat. It says something I still struggle with too. What are strategies to reframing valuing the process and not the product?
This is hard because we talk about this, but society gives us a lot of pressure about the product. I'll tell you, actually, it's funny. I was doing this presentation for, I don't even know how long, like I've given it, multiple times. And there was one slide on here that in one of those, it was either fear of failure or fear of success in that little thought bubble. It had a typo in it, but I would always forget to go back and change it. I would only catch it ever when I was making the presentation. Like I would go back through and look at it. Finally, I ended up changing it. But that discomfort with that mistake, like it's like, oh, and I would just kind of make fun of myself with it. And I think that's helpful, is just some of that self-deprecation, like recognizing like, yeah, yep, there it is, that there's, me being twice exceptional and being ADHD, sometimes my mantra is, well, some days the ADHD wins. And so it can't always be perfect. And I've just got to work on the process and improve those things. I think more than anything, it's about the growth as well. It's about looking at where you were and where you are now and how far you've come, and realizing that it's about an internal process as opposed to what the external value is that people are giving for it. But it is. Listen, I think it's really natural for high achievers in general to struggle with this, because when you know that you can do well, you want to do well. Like that's part of being human. Alfred Adler is a psychologist, and one of my favorite quotes from him that he talks about is about how all of human life is a striving for perfection. He doesn't necessarily mean perfection like exactly how we're talking about it, but he's talking about that growth. Humans want to grow. We are motivated to learn and to change. And so the more we can try to find those things, the better. The other thing maybe I would suggest there, as much as possible, is to make sure that you're not doing the goal vaulting, where you're just always constantly raising the bar, and try to focus on the progress that's really kind of measurable or visible, as opposed to like this. If you just look at the big picture, it's like it's so broad and ambiguous, it's hard to really notice where that progress is happening. And so that might be a way to like really focus on like, oh, well, I'm going to work on this particular thing, and then and focus on that process of growth there, as opposed to like just what the outcome is.
Or maybe that mistake in your presentation was intentional so that you could lead by example that, hey, see,
Yes.
I put this mistake in purposefully.
I should go back and put it back in, is what you're saying. I mean, I could put, I'm sure I've got the
Well,
old version
yeah,
somewhere on my.
it's like purposely leaving a math question wrong, empty,
Yeah.
right? Because you put it in there to show people, see, it doesn't have to be perfect.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
see what
Actually,
you're
that's a
doing
great idea.
there.
Just as for teachers too, like to model it. Yeah.
I
Just
see what you're
show it,
doing
like
there.
show
Very,
those
very
mistakes and
genius.
just kind of like laugh about it a little bit. And man, but yeah, it's so hard for kids.
If you don't mind, there is one more question in the chat.
Sure.
It says, "What are some strategies for an others oriented perfectionist to manage unrealistic expectations of others?"
Yeah. So I think some this is really hard because for some kids it's just so automatic. It's almost like a knee-jerk reaction. And sometimes you have to really build some self-awareness about it, so that they realize what they're doing and really build perspective taking about what other people might be thinking and feeling when you correct them in those ways. And also, what is your motivation? Like the motivation for one person who is correcting somebody because they would feel embarrassed if they made their mistake is different perhaps than the kid who's in the group project who is just taking on all the responsibilities because they don't trust their group mates to do it well. And so recognizing that, and then also so much of this too, actually, with all of these types of perfectionists, is recognizing what is in your control versus out of your control. And you know, for those kids who are those others oriented perfectionists, honestly, they're just causing themselves more stress than anything, more than they're even impacting those others. And so having those conversations, helping them build that, helping them recognize like why it is that they feel that pressure to correct others. You know, I will say that this is one that I struggle with quite a bit, just because you know, I really like things to be accurate. And so like my husband is I mentioned he's the video and audio producer for the podcast, but he was in radio for a really long time. So when he tells a story, he likes to embellish it. And I like to correct him because I'm like, well, that's not actually how it happened. I like to, you know, he gets very irritated with me. And I have learned over the years to try to back off, but I still am a sucker for that, right? Like it's just an ongoing process. There's never going to, well, I don't want to say never. It's hard to totally get rid of those traits, but also like if you hear me talking about though, it's like I'm kind of laughing at myself about it. I recognize it. I realize like, and I, you know, it's like I try to apologize when I do that. And so you know, but just really having recognizing the impact on those relationships, you know, is like, and doing that perspective taking is probably the most powerful way to try to help kids overcome that.
Well, thank you again so much, Emily, for being our speaker for this month. Thank you everyone for joining. I am going to put in the chat a link to our post survey. It's very short. If you don't mind taking that post survey, it will be anonymous. And yeah, this will conclude our December guest speaker session. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you again so much, Emily. It was a very good presentation.
Thank you so much. And I'll send across those handouts and the those resources that I mentioned as
Perfect.
well,
And
so you can
I'll
share
make
those
sure it
out.
gets out to the registered participants.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you,
Thanks so much for
everyone.
having me.
Bye.